How do we define greatness in film? That question is distinctly hard to grasp. Should the quality of a film be derived from the critical acclaim it receives? The audience reception? The technical prowess? Or should it be based on how much money the film is able to bring in, or the impact it has on popular culture as a whole? If you pose this question to a film lover, you could receive any one of those answers as well as many more countless reasons as to what makes a movie or a filmmaker truly great. The reason film has become so ingrained in the American cultural zeitgeist is because it has a unique ability to build solidarity amongst people of all different backgrounds through the stories they tell. Especially in times of struggle and hardship, movies have the ability to give the viewer a sense of hope in a time of destitution, and for these reasons, Frank Capra is a great filmmaker. The legacy of Frank Capra is one of great contradictions. On one hand, Capra has ingrained himself into film history as one of the most beloved directors of all time through his films that depict a hopeful and bright view of America in a time where the country was in great turmoil. On the other hand, his films have often been dismissed by critics for portraying an unrealistic view of the world in the disguise of realism. Capra is one of the most successful filmmakers of his generation, yet the film he is remembered for today was only appreciated long after he had stopped making films. The same themes and messages that defined Capra's films and made them so successful were also the same reasons he fell into obscurity. Frank Capra is truly a one-of-a-kind character in the history of film that in many ways could have only existed in the time that he did. Through his stories that celebrate American individualism and the happiness it brings, he inspired hope in a generation of Americans who seldom felt hope during the time of economic despair. And just as he had brought so much hope into the millions of Americans struggling through the Great Depression as well as World War II, he was quickly discarded and forgotten when their lives improved. It is time to remember the life of Frank Capra. Francesco Rosario Capra was born on May 18, 1898 in Bisacchino, Italy, a small town outside of Palermo. At age 6, Capra and his family packed up and moved from Italy to Los Angeles. After graduating high school, Capra decided to attend the California Institute of Technology and studied chemical engineering. He was the only member of his family to become college educated. Following his graduation in 1918, Capra decided to join the Army and was commissioned to be a second lieutenant due to his service in the ROTC in college. After serving for a year teaching mathematics to soldiers, Capra contracted the Spanish flu and was medically discharged. Despite his short-lived time serving in the military during the First World War, he was what some might say patriotic to a fault, and wanted to serve his adopted country whenever possible, even later on in his life. After the Army, Capra bounced from job to job for a couple of years until 1922, when he signed his first deal to make a film where he was paid $75 to make a short film about a poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled Fulta Fisher's Boating House. He continued to work on minor film projects until 1924, when he was hired on as a gag writer for the program Hal Roach's Our Gang, the earliest iteration of The Little Rascals. While Capra's time writing for Our Gang was short-lived, only lasting 7 episodes, it was extremely impactful to his career, as it was on this show where he met Harry Langdon, a prominent silent comedian of the time. Capra and Langdon grew close during their time that they worked together on Our Gang, to where, when Langdon left the show, he brought Capra along with him to be his personal writer and director for his upcoming feature films associated with First National Studios. They made 3 films together between 1926 and 1927, which all garnered critical and audience acclaim. These were Capra's first successful features that he worked on. However, following the release of these films, Capra's relationship soured with Langdon, which ultimately led to his firing. Capra directed one more film with First National Studios, and then left to work at a newly started company that was hoping to stay afloat in a time of the large studio near monopoly on the industry. It was at this studio where Capra would establish himself as a force in the film industry, and the studio as a mainstay in Hollywood. The studio? Columbia Pictures. When Capra was hired by Columbia Pictures, they were just 3 years from the rebranding to Columbia and were considered a B-movie studio, part of the Poverty Row. This all changed with the hiring of Frank Capra, which coincided with the most innovative and game-changing invention to come to film, the introduction of sound. The year prior to the hiring of Capra, 1927, the film The Jazz Singer was released that revolutionized film as it was the first movie to have audio matched to the video. Columbia wanted to capitalize on the new technology and employed Capra as their quote-unquote expert due to his background in engineering. Capra took this in his stride. While he did admit that he was working blind in the early days of sound film, he was ready to make the change, as he had stated before that he, quote, wasn't at home in silent film. They got to work, and in 1929, the younger generation was released, beginning the age of sound film for Columbia Pictures and for Frank Capra. The themes of the film are primarily focused on the overlying message: there is more to life than money, a theme that is woven into many of Capra's most iconic works. This film's themes are also poignant because they come mere months before the stock market crashed, sending the world into the Great Depression. While this film was not a smash hit at the box office, it set the stage for what was to come for Frank Capra. While Frank Capra and Columbia Pictures were building their reputation and growing through the first half of the 1930s, the true golden age of Frank Capra began in 1934 with the release of his film It Happened One Night, starring Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable. The film follows Ellie Andrews, an heiress to an immense wealth who goes on the run from her father as she tries to find autonomy by marrying a fortune-hunting pilot, King Wesley. On her way, she meets Peter Warren, a recently fired reporter who recognized her. Peter learns of her situation and agrees to keep her secret if she gives him an exclusive story. It Happened One Night appeals to the longing for escapism that was prevalent during the time, as America was still in the depths of the Great Depression, with still no end in sight. The film was an immediate box office success, grossing $1.36 million in its first year, making it the fifth highest grossing film of that year, on a film that cost just $325,000 to make. Where the film truly transcends is in its critical reception. It Happened One Night is considered one of the best films ever made. Among its many accolades, the film became the first in history to receive all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adaptive Screenplay, and still remains as only one of 3 films to achieve that level of critical success. This was only the start of Capra's success. Between 1934 and 1941, Frank Capra would release a total of 7 feature films: It Happened One Night, Broadway Bills, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, The Lost Horizon, You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Meet John Doe. Of these films, all but one received critical acclaim, and all of them received immense box office success en route to establishing Frank Capra as the most prominent director of the time and cementing Columbia Pictures as a force in the Hollywood studio system. What made Capra so successful was his ability to empathize with the struggles of the common man and rally against the oppressive powers that have caused their hardships. In It Happened One Night, it's Ellie's father. In You Can't Take It With You, it's the rich and cruel banker Anthony Kirby. In Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, it's the crooked politicians Taylor and Payne. Capra takes a very individualist stance throughout most of his films, portraying that the efforts of the individual could turn the tides of a person's struggles. The idea of these films' messages worked during this time because the people were looking for any sign of light in a sea of economic darkness. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, Capra decided to leave Columbia Pictures and enlisted in the U.S. Army once more to pledge his patriotism to his adopted country. Under U.S. Chief of Staff George Marshall, Capra was tasked with creating a series of, quote, information videos for soldiers, which were a series of propaganda films which the U.S. military used to justify their involvement in the war to their soldiers. The aptly named Why We Fight was a series of 7 films that portrayed to the American soldiers the principles of the United States that the young men were putting their lives on the line for. The first film in the series, entitled Prelude to War, won the Academy Award in 1942 for the Best Documentary Feature. Capra was discharged from the Army in 1945. Upon his return to Hollywood, Frank Capra, along with William Wyler and George Stevens, accomplished directors in their own right, founded Liberty Films, an independent studio where the directors could create their films without the oversight of a major studio head. It was under this company where Capra created arguably his most influential film of his career, It's a Wonderful Life. The film follows the story of George Bailey, a man who dreamed big for his life, only for it to fall into a place of dissatisfaction as he had to compromise his dreams to help his loved ones succeed. When George contemplates suicide, he is visited by his guardian angel, Clarence, and is shown how different and unhappy the world would be if he was not in it. The film pulls from the same sentiments of Capra's most successful films, using the triumphs of the individual, expressing the power that one person has on the world around them. Despite these similarities in themes, It's a Wonderful Life actually performed significantly worse than any of the films he released through Columbia Pictures. The film only garnered roughly $3.3 million in the box office revenue, which did not account for the estimated $3.7 million budget. It was critically recognized, being nominated for 5 Academy Awards, but the capital loss was too much for Liberty Films, which was only able to produce one more film before closing their doors. It's a Wonderful Life was not recognized until decades later when, in 1974, it became a holiday classic after falling into the public domain. The film is now considered to be one of the greatest films of all time and has become a beloved masterpiece enjoyed by millions around the country every holiday season. The reason why It's a Wonderful Life failed to impress at the box office could be understood from a couple of different perspectives. But what I believe is the primary reason is Capra's inability to keep up with the audiences. What made his film so successful during the 1930s was his and his screenwriter's ability to create stories which showed normal, everyday people being successful and happy, despite the horrible situations that they were living under. His films worked to separate the idea of having money and being happy. These messages inspired millions of Americans to be hopeful and believe that they too could be happy even though they were going through personal hardships. However, once World War II and the Great Depression had ended, the need for stories of hope and happiness in the face of struggles had gone by the wayside. The economy had rebounded, and people felt much more unified as a nation, thus making a story about a man fighting against the tyranny of a greedy businessman much less relevant in the minds of the general public as it was before. Thus, the failure of It's a Wonderful Life. Following the dissolution of Liberty Films, Capra largely stepped away from the film industry. He directed a few films with Paramount Pictures in the early 1950s and created a series of educational science documentaries before making his final theatrical film in 1961, entitled Pocketful of Miracles, which was a remake of his 1931 film Lady for a Day. The reason for Capra leaving the film industry was largely due to his opposition of the direction that the industry was going, being more reliant on shock value and violence. When discussing why he left the film industry, Capra stated that he, quote, refused to adjust to the cynicism of the New World Order. How do we define greatness in film? I believe that greatness can be defined by the legacy the filmmaker leaves behind. Frank Capra was a pioneer in the film industry that drew from the conventions of the silent era and incorporated sound to create one of the earliest pieces of masterful art in the sound era. Through his films, he was able to breathe hope into a national community where hope was hard to come by. His films, though admittedly extremely idealistic, showed the best and the worst of humanity and allowed the audiences to question those who are in power. They make us laugh and they make us cry. Capra is rightfully remembered today for his work on It's a Wonderful Life, though it is important to remember his work that truly defined an era in a time of hardship. His time at the pinnacle was not long, but what he created at that time was generation defining. So, let's remember Frank Capra not just as the man who created It's a Wonderful Life, but also as one of the greatest directors of all time.